I have to ask, both because it's fresh on our minds given recent acquired activity, but also you write about it in the memo. What has the two of your journey been with Amazon? Did you discuss that? Was that part of this thinking about value and growth perhaps not being two different things?
I think it's also really interesting because a typical value investor, you sort of look just at the fundamentals of the business and you look at the economics of the business. And Buffett is very famous for saying that you want a business that an idiot can run.
Because eventually someone will.
Yeah, exactly. And so he sort of talks about the primacy of business model over management. But I think Amazon's a great example of the opposite because you could have never dreamed that if you owned Amazon when the story was about growing as a retailer, you could have never dreamed of AWS. That shows what happens when you bet on an amazing founder who can leverage their business to create value in really compelling other ways. And so I think it's a great business case study, but it's also a case study of putting faith in a management team and recognizing the optionality that comes with that.
Howard, did Amazon ever intersect with your investing career?
No, I'm a recovered equity investor. I was in the equity research department of Citibank from 69 to 78, and then I left. And in the credit field, where I've spent the last 44 years, we historically have not had contact with what you would call a tech company.
Although they had some distressed debt at one point in time after the tech bubble.
Yeah. But again, remember, we put a very heavy emphasis on predictability. And I think that for the most part, Oaktree does what Warren and Charlie do. They put it on the too hard pile.
I think, by the way, one other thing that I would add about Amazon that may be too wonky, but also may be interesting is I think it's also an example of one of the things we sort of talk about in the memo, which is it's hard to just take a sort of knee-jerk 30,000 foot view and you really have to sort of dive in and understand things. So, what people said for the longest time was that Amazon was losing money and could never be profitable.
A charity run for the benefit of the American consumer.
Exactly. And that came from looking a lot at the income statement and recognizing that they were losing money, partially because they were continuing to lower price to achieve scale. But I think what's interesting is they actually had a very favorable cash conversion cycle. So the business was much more sound from a free cash flow perspective, much earlier than it was from an income state perspective.
Michael Mauboussin wrote the research note that was not as popular as Amazon.bomb and Amazon.toast, but he called it cashflow.com. And that's what it was.
Yeah. And so I think it's just another sign of the fact that you probably shouldn't come to a conclusion about something without really trying to understand it for yourself.
Well, this captures two of our earliest points of discussion. Number one, that the companies we're talking about are more complex than the simple profit earners of the, let's say, deep value era. And so you can't, as Andrews says, have a knee-jerk reaction to some superficial knowledge. You have to really get deep. And then the other concept was this idea of optional profitability. The value investor wants to maximize cash flow and profits, EPS, but the growth investor sees losses sometimes as the right thing in the interest of the future. So that's a very, very important divergence.
But also very often not. And so you can't just be in one camp and you can't say, well, I shouldn't care ever about losses, or I should just take for granted that all reinvestments in growth are good. But you also can't take the point of view that none of them are good.
Right. Wasn't it Mark Twain who said all generalizations are flawed, including this one? And by the way, when I say the value investor does this and the growth investor does that, probably the biggest single theme of the memo was that dichotomy should not be so hardwired.
Who got the truth? Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? Sit me down, say it straight. Another story on the way. Who got the truth? Who got the truth now?